If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's continue. Edward Miller had always believed that success was measured in numbers: contracts signed, companies acquired, investments multiplied. At 43, he had built a real estate empire in New York City, transforming abandoned lots into luxury condos, shopping malls, and corporate skyscrapers that changed the city's skyline. His name was synonymous with prosperity, with strategic vision, with a man who never lost a deal. In business magazines, Edward always appeared impeccable, in an Italian suit, a Swiss watch on his wrist, his gaze firm and confident. He was the perfect picture of a successful entrepreneur. But behind that polished image, there was an emptiness that Edward could never name, a silence that echoed through the halls of his mansion on the Upper East Side, an absence that no acquisition could fill. Beatrice, his first wife, had passed away 3 years ago, taken by a silent illness that consumed her vitality in just a few months. Edward still remembered her smile, the gentle way she organized the house, making everything seem light even when he came home. Late, tired, his head full of spreadsheets and projections. Beatrice never complained about his absence. She just took care of Melissa, their only daughter, with a dedication that Edward at the time considered natural. Melissa was only 5 when her mother was gone. Edward vaguely remembered the little girl crying in her grandmother's arms during the funeral, her brown eyes flooded with tears, not quite understanding why Mommy wasn't coming back. He, busy handling bureaucratic matters, receiving condolences from business partners and acquaintances, barely managed to hug his daughter in those days. There was so much to do, so much to organize. Pain, Edward learned early on, could be managed like a company in crisis, by setting priorities, delegating tasks, and staying focused on what could be controlled. For 2 years, he and Melissa lived in a strange routine. The girl was cared for by Mrs. Teresa, the housekeeper who had worked in the house since before she was born. Teresa was a woman in her early 50s, from a humble background, having come from rural Georgia. She had hands calloused from years of work, but also a maternal gaze that naturally turned to Melissa. She prepared the meals, took the girl to school, helped with homework, and invented games on the afternoons when Edward didn't get home before 9 at night. The house ran like a Swiss watch, silent and efficient. Edward rarely questioned this dynamic. After all, Melissa seemed fine. She ate well, got good grades, and didn't cause any trouble. He believed he was fulfilling his role by ensuring his daughter had everything: an elite private school, designer clothes, imported toys, French and ballet lessons. Providing financially was his form of love. It was what he knew how to do. The rest, he thought, would come naturally. But the loneliness of the mansion began to bother him. Not his own exactly. Edward was used to spending hours alone in his office, in meetings, at business dinners. The loneliness that bothered him was more subtle. It was the silence of a dinner served for one, the feeling that the house was too big, too organized, too empty. His friends started suggesting he meet someone, that he rebuild his life, that a little girl needed a mother figure. Edward resisted for a while, but deep down the idea began to make sense. Not for him, of course, for Melissa. It was at a charity gala in Manhattan that he met Sylvia Drummond. She was stunning that night, in a navy blue dress that highlighted her elegant figure, her blonde hair impeccably styled, her smile calculated, and her green eyes seeming to see beyond appearances. Sylvia was 36, came from a traditional but fading family in Greenwich, Connecticut, and had worked for years as an image consultant for executives. She knew exactly what to say, how to carry herself, what perfume to wear. She was sophisticated, intelligent, articulate, and above all, she knew how to spot an opportunity. When Edward mentioned, almost without thinking, that he had a young daughter at home, Sylvia tilted her head slightly and replied with a studied sweetness, "It must be difficult raising a girl on your own. She needs so much affection, attention, a female presence to look up to." Edward nodded, feeling that someone finally understood his situation. In the following months, Sylvia made her presence known gradually and strategically. Casual encounters, discreet lunches, conversations about child rearing, about the importance of a well-structured routine. Edward let himself be drawn into the idea that Sylvia would be the perfect solution. She wasn't just beautiful and polite. She was practical, organized, someone who could turn that house into a real home. In less than 6 months, they were married. The ceremony was discreet, just close family and a few intimate friends, in a chapel near Central Park. Melissa, at 7, was present, dressed in a white lace dress that Sylvia had personally chosen. The girl held a small bouquet of flowers, smiling shyly for the cameras. Edward looked at the scene and felt a strange sense of relief. Finally, he thought, everything was falling into place. Sylvia took command of the house with impressive efficiency. In the very first days, she rearranged the rooms, changed the curtains, hired new staff, and established strict schedules for everything. The house, which once had a welcoming air despite the sadness, became impeccable, almost like a museum. Every object had its exact place. Every room was decorated with a refined but cold taste. Edward approved of all the changes. After all, Sylvia had good taste, and he trusted her judgment. What he didn't notice, too busy with the merger of 2 development firms that consumed his nights and weekends, was that something had changed in Melissa. The girl, who used to run through the house, laughing with Mrs. Teresa, now walked silently through the hallways. Her room, which held drawings taped to the walls, stuffed animals scattered on the bed, and a collection of children's books that Beatrice used to read to her before bed, was gradually emptied. Sylvia explained to Edward that it was important to renovate, to create a more mature environment, more suitable for a growing girl. The stuffed animals were donated. The drawings were stored in boxes in the basement. Her mother's books were replaced with educational encyclopedias. Edward agreed with everything. After all, Sylvia understood. Education, child development. She spoke with authority about discipline, about the importance of creating healthy habits, about not spoiling a child. And Melissa, apparently, didn't complain. She was quiet, well-behaved, obedient. To Edward, this was a sign that everything was fine. He didn't have time to notice the details, his daughter's sunken eyes, the way she avoided Sylvia's gaze, the way her body tensed whenever she heard her stepmother's voice. Mrs. Teresa, however, began to notice strange things, small signs that made her uneasy. Melissa, who used to eat with a healthy appetite, now left her plate almost full. She would say she wasn't hungry, that she'd had a snack earlier. But Teresa knew it wasn't true. The girl was losing weight, becoming pale, with dark circles under her eyes. When Teresa tried to talk to her, Melissa would change the subject, force a smile, and say everything was fine. "I'm just tired, Mrs. Teresa. School is tough." And there was something else. Teresa started finding Melissa's bed untouched in the morning, the comforter perfectly smooth, the pillows in place, as if no one had slept there. The first time she found it odd but didn't say anything. Maybe the girl had woken up early and made the bed herself, she thought. But it happened again and again, and when Teresa asked gently if Melissa was sleeping well, the girl just mumbled, "Yes, I am. I sleep very well." But her eyes told a different story. They were tired, frightened eyes, the eyes of someone carrying a weight too heavy for her age. Teresa felt a tightness in her chest. She had known Melissa since she was a baby, had seen the girl take her first steps, say her first words, run through the house chasing imaginary butterflies. This quiet, withdrawn, scared child was not the Melissa she knew. One morning, Teresa woke up earlier than usual. It was 5:30 in the morning, and she went down to the kitchen to make coffee. As she passed the hallway leading to the service area, she heard a soft noise. It was almost imperceptible, a slight movement, a muffled sigh. Teresa stopped, her heart racing. She walked slowly toward the sound and found Melissa coming out of a small storage closet off the laundry room. The girl was barefoot, wearing only thin pajamas, her hair disheveled, her face marked by exhaustion. "Melissa?" Teresa whispered, startled. "What are you doing here, honey?" The girl froze. Her eyes widened as if she'd been caught doing something forbidden. I was just looking for something." "At this hour? And why aren't you in your room?" Melissa lowered her head, her hands trembling slightly. "I was, Mrs. Teresa. I just came down here now." But Teresa didn't believe her. She went into the storage closet and saw, in the corner, a thin blanket folded on the cold floor. There was a body impression on it, as if someone had spent hours there. Teresa's heart pounded. "Melissa, did you sleep here?" The girl didn't answer. She just started to cry silently, tears streaming down her face without a sound. Teresa knelt beside her, holding her fragile shoulders. "Honey, what's going on? Why are you sleeping here? Your room is so beautiful, so comfortable." Melissa wiped her tears quickly, as if afraid of being seen. "I can't tell you, Mrs. Teresa. Please don't tell anyone, please." "But, Melissa, I need to understand. Are you afraid of something?" The girl nodded, trembling. "If you tell, it'll be worse. She said no one will believe me, that they'll say I'm a liar, that I'm making things up to get attention." Teresa felt a chill run down her spine. "Who said that, honey?" But before Melissa could answer, they heard footsteps upstairs. Sylvia's voice echoed down the hall. "Melissa, where are you?" The girl pulled away from Teresa as if she'd been shocked. "I have to go. Please, Mrs. Teresa, don't say anything, please." And she ran off, silently climbing the stairs, disappearing down the hallway. Teresa stood there, alone in the cold storage closet, looking at the blanket on the floor. Her heart was heavy. She knew something was very wrong. But how could she prove it? How could she make anyone believe her? Edward was barely home, and when he was, he seemed blind to everything that didn't involve contracts and meetings. That same week, Teresa tried to talk to Edward. She waited for him to arrive, it was already past 9 at night, and approached him in the garage before he went upstairs. "Mr. Miller, I need to speak with you. It's about Melissa." Edward was tired, his tie loosened, his briefcase full of documents under his arm. "Mrs. Teresa, can this be quick? I have an early meeting tomorrow and still need to review some contracts tonight." "It's important, sir. The girl isn't well. She's losing weight, not sleeping well. She seems scared all the time." Edward frowned. Scared? Of what? Teresa hesitated. She had no proof, just her intuition and that blanket in the storage closet. "I'm not sure, sir, but something is wrong." "Don't you think she seems different?" Edward thought for a moment. In truth, he barely saw his daughter lately. When he got home, she was already asleep. When he left, she hadn't woken up yet. On weekends, Sylvia organized outings, visits to clubs, educational activities. Melissa always seemed quiet, but he attributed it to the natural shyness of her age. "Sylvia told me she's going through an adjustment phase. It's normal, Mrs. Teresa. She's growing up, maturing." "But Mr. Miller, Mrs. Teresa, I trust Sylvia. She understands children. She studied education, worked with families for years. If she says everything is fine, then it is. Melissa just needs time and routine. Sylvia is doing a great job." Teresa lowered her head, defeated. She knew insisting would be useless. Edward believed Sylvia blindly, and she, a simple housekeeper, had no power to change that. "I understand, sir. Good night." Edward went up to his room where Sylvia was already waiting, reading a design magazine. She looked up and smiled. "Tough day?" "As always." He loosened his tie, tossed his briefcase onto the armchair. "Mrs. Teresa was telling me that Melissa isn't well, that she seems different." Sylvia sighed, closing the magazine gently. "Teresa is exaggerating, Edward. It's natural for her to be jealous. After all, for years she was the only female figure in Melissa's life. Now that I'm here, she feels threatened. It's understandable, but we can't let it interfere with the girl's upbringing." Edward nodded, relieved by the explanation. It made sense. "And Melissa, is she really okay?" "Yes, she is. She's just adapting to the new rules. Before, she was spoiled, had no routine, did whatever she wanted. Now she's learning discipline, responsibility. It's a process, but she'll thank us when she's older, believe me." Edward came closer, kissing Sylvia's forehead. "You're amazing. I don't know what I'd do without you." Sylvia smiled, a calculated, cold smile. "I just want what's best for this family, darling, for you and for Melissa." But in the next room, Melissa was awake, staring. At the dark ceiling, her heart aching. She knew no one would believe her, that Sylvia's words were stronger than hers, that she was alone, and that the night, as always, would be long, cold, and terrifying. The next day at school, her teacher, Julia Anderson, began to notice changes in Melissa. Julia was young, only 28, but she was extremely dedicated. She taught 3rd grade and knew her students well. Melissa had always been a participative, curious child who loved to read and draw. But in recent months she had become a shadow of her former self. She was quiet during lessons, avoided playing at recess, and dozed off at her desk. Julia approached her one afternoon during recess. Melissa was sitting alone under a tree, hugging her knees, staring into space. "Melissa, are you okay, sweetie?" The girl started, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Miss Anderson. Don't you want to play with the other kids?" "I'm just tired." Julia sat down beside her, concerned. "Have you been sleeping well? Because I've noticed you have dark circles under your eyes and sometimes you doze off in class." Melissa lowered her head. "I sleep fine, it's just school is hard." "But your grades are good, Melissa. You've always been an excellent student. Is something worrying you? Any problems at home?" The girl hugged her knees tighter. For a moment, Julia thought she was going to say something. But then Melissa just shook her head. "No, Miss Anderson. Everything's fine at home. My dad got remarried and my stepmom is really nice. She takes good care of me." Julia wasn't entirely convinced, but she didn't press. She just stroked Melissa's hair and said, "If you ever need to talk, I'm here. You can trust me, okay?" Melissa nodded, but her eyes remained empty. Meanwhile, inside the Miller mansion, Sylvia was documenting everything in a notebook locked in her personal drawer. She noted times, behaviors, reactions. Every time Melissa cried, every time she complained, every time she showed fatigue. Everything was meticulously recorded, not out of maternal care but as a strategy. Sylvia was building a narrative, a story that, at the right moment, would prove the girl was problematic, unstable, in need of constant supervision, perhaps even psychiatric care. And as she wrote, Sylvia smiled. Everything was going according to plan. Edward Miller remained blind to it all, submerged in his spreadsheets, his contracts, his ambitions. He didn't see that right under his nose. His daughter was slowly disappearing. The following months were marked by a cruel routine that settled silently into that mansion. Melissa woke up every morning at 6, her body aching from the cold floor where she spent her nights. Sylvia had established strict rules. The girl had to be perfectly dressed, her uniform impeccable, her hair combed without a single strand out of place, her backpack organized. Any slip-up, any imperfection was grounds for long talks about discipline, about responsibility, about how she needed to be better. "Your mother spoiled you rotten," Sylvia would say, adjusting the collar of Melissa's uniform with sharp movements. "She let you grow up without limits, with no sense of obligation. But that's over. Here, you're going to learn what it means to be a real person." Melissa would just lower her head and agree. She had learned that contradicting Sylvia made everything worse. The nights grew longer, the cold more intense, the words more cruel. So she became invisible, silent, obedient, anything to survive until the next day. At school, Julia Anderson couldn't get Melissa out of her mind. The girl was clearly suffering, but every time the teacher tried to get close, Melissa shut down even more. It was as if she was afraid to talk, afraid to trust. Julia decided to schedule a meeting with the girl's father. She needed to understand what was happening in that house. Edward received the message from the school secretary with some irritation. He didn't have time for school meetings. Melissa had good grades. She wasn't a behavior problem, so why did the teacher want to talk to him? But Sylvia, upon being informed, quickly offered a solution. "I'll go, honey. After all, I'm the one who oversees her routine. You're too busy. Let me handle it." Edward readily agreed. It was practical, efficient. Sylvia always knew how to handle these things. 2 days later, Sylvia was sitting in Julia Anderson's classroom, wearing a cordial smile and perfect posture. Julia began carefully. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Miller. I wanted to talk about Melissa. I've noticed some changes in her that concern me." Sylvia tilted her head, expressing maternal concern. "What kind of changes, Miss Anderson?" "She's very quiet, withdrawn. She doesn't play with her classmates anymore. She dozes off during class. And she always seems tired. And she has deep, dark circles under her eyes. I'm worried about her well-being." Sylvia sighed, as if carrying a great burden. "Miss Anderson, I understand your concern, and I appreciate you caring about Melissa. The truth is, she's going through a difficult time. You know, she lost her mother very young, and the arrival of a new maternal figure in her life has been complicated. She's resisting the adjustment, creating situations to get attention." Julia frowned. "Get attention?" "Yes. She's been making up stories, playing the victim, trying to manipulate situations so everyone feels sorry for her. It's a defense mechanism, I understand, but we're working on it with her. My husband and I have established a firm routine with clear rules to help her get through this phase. It's a delicate process." Julia wasn't convinced. But the dark circles, the extreme fatigue, that doesn't seem like just an emotional phase. "Is she sleeping well at home?" Sylvia smiled with condescending patience. "Miss Anderson, children at this age sometimes have trouble sleeping. They're on their phones reading, playing. We're working on that too. But I'm sure that with time and the structure we're providing, she'll get better. You need to trust the process." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but Julia left the meeting with a strange feeling in her stomach. Sylvia had been polite, articulate, convincing, but something didn't add up. There was a coldness in her eyes, a lack of genuine concern. Julia decided she would keep a close eye on Melissa. Something was wrong, she was sure of it. Meanwhile, at home, Mrs. Teresa continued to witness small horrors that left her distressed. One evening she had to return to the mansion to pick up something she had forgotten. It was almost 10 at night, and she used her back key to enter quietly. As she passed the second-floor hallway, she heard voices. Sylvia's voice, cold and controlled, coming from Melissa's room. "You are going to learn to be grateful, Melissa. Your father worked so hard to give you everything, and you repay him with this ingratitude, with this laziness." Teresa approached the slightly ajar door, her heart pounding. Melissa was standing in the middle of the room, trembling, her eyes red from crying silently. "I wasn't ungrateful, Sylvia. I just asked to sleep in my bed tonight. I'm so tired." "Tired? Children your age don't get tired. You're just spoiled. And you know what happens to spoiled children. They grow up weak, incapable, useless. Is that what you want to be? Useless? No. Then you'll go where I told you to go, and you'll stay there until morning without complaining, without making a sound. And if I hear a single peep, you'll stay there another night." "Understood." Melissa nodded, tears silently streaming down her face. Teresa wanted to scream, to burst into that room and protect the girl, but she knew she would be fired on the spot. And if she left, who would look after Melissa? Who would be there to at least witness the child's suffering? So she backed away, heartbroken, and left the house without a sound. But that night, Teresa began to make her own notes. Dates, times, everything she saw and heard. She didn't know when or how she would use the information, but she felt that one day it would be important. The days dragged on for Melissa like years. She had learned to survive on autopilot. She would wake up, get ready, go to school, come back, do her homework, eat dinner in silence and wait. Wait for the night, when Sylvia would come with her cold instructions. Wait for the moment she would be sent to that cold, dark place, where the floor was hard and the fear was constant. And wait for the morning, when she could leave and pretend for a few hours that her life was normal. Edward, oblivious to it all, celebrated his professional successes. He closed a multi-million-dollar deal with an international hotel chain, acquired 2 strategic plots of land along the FDR Drive, and was on the cover of a business magazine. His life was a series of victories, and whenever he came home he found everything in order. Sylvia greeted him with a smile. The house was impeccable. Melissa was quiet in her room. Everything seemed perfect. But there was another employee in the house who was also starting to suspect something. Mr. Anthony, the driver and head of security who had worked for the Miller family for almost 15 years, knew that house like the back of his hand. He had watched Melissa grow up, had talked with Beatrice about the dreams she had for her daughter, had carried the girl, on his shoulders when she was little. And now seeing Melissa so changed, so faded, he felt that something was deeply wrong. Anthony started paying more attention to the details. He noticed that Melissa never asked him to tell her stories during the drives to school anymore. He noticed she avoided looking at the house when they arrived. He noticed that whenever Sylvia was around, the girl became tense, like a cornered animal. And one night, while making his security rounds around the back of the house, he saw a faint light coming from the storage closet in the service area. Curious, he approached and saw through a crack in the door Melissa huddled on the floor, hugging her knees, crying softly. Anthony wanted to go in, to ask what was happening. But then he heard footsteps, Sylvia coming down the stairs. He quickly stepped back, hiding in the shadows. He saw Sylvia open the closet door, look at Melissa coldly and say only, "Quiet, or tomorrow will be worse." And then she closed the door and went back inside. Anthony stood there, paralyzed, feeling anger and helplessness burn in his chest. He had to do something. But what? How? Could he report it without proof? How could he make Edward believe him? He decided he would talk to Mrs. Teresa. Maybe together they could find a way to help Melissa. The next day, Anthony and Teresa met in the garden, away from the house. He told her what he had seen. Teresa, with tears in her eyes, confirmed his suspicions. "I knew it, Mr. Anthony. I knew something was wrong. But Mr. Miller won't listen. He trusts that woman blindly." "Then we need proof," Anthony said, determined. "Proof he can't ignore." Teresa nodded. "I've been writing everything down. Dates, times, what I see and hear. But I don't know if that will be enough." "It'll have to be, because if we don't do anything, that little girl is going to end up broken inside. And that, Mrs. Teresa, we can't allow." Meanwhile, inside the mansion, Melissa was sitting at the kitchen table, pretending to do her homework. But her thoughts were far away. She remembered when her mother was alive, when the house was full of laughter, when she could sleep in her own bed without fear. She remembered the smell of the cakes Beatrice used to bake on, Sundays, the stories she told before bed, the loving way she fixed her hair. Now all of that seemed like a distant dream. Melissa wasn't even sure if those memories were real or if she had invented them to endure the pain of the present. All she knew was that she was alone, completely alone, and that no one, not even her father, seemed capable of saving her. But what Melissa didn't know was that, slowly, the pieces on a chessboard were moving. Julia was still watching. Teresa was still writing. Anthony was still keeping guard. And somewhere deep in his dormant consciousness, Edward was beginning to feel an unease, a restlessness he couldn't yet name, a question that would soon force him to see the truth that was right in front of his eyes. And when that truth finally came to light, nothing would ever be the same again. The weeks that followed brought an almost imperceptible change in Edward Miller. Nothing drastic, nothing that interrupted his work routine or shook his trust in Sylvia. But there were small moments, brief instances when a question would surface in his mind and dissolve before he could truly examine it. Why? Was Melissa so quiet? Why did she never ask to go to the park like she used to? Why, when he got home, was she always in her room, always with the door closed, always saying she was doing homework? These were questions Edward quickly pushed aside, replacing them with rational justifications. Children changed, they grew up, they matured. Sylvia had explained it so many times. Melissa was just adapting, developing independence, learning responsibility. It was all part of a healthy process, at least that's what he wanted to believe. But on a Thursday night something happened that planted the first real seed of doubt in his heart. Edward had arrived home earlier than usual, around 8 o'clock, because an important meeting had been cancelled at the last minute. As he entered through the garage, he heard voices coming from the second floor. One was Sylvia's, the other was Melissa's, but they weren't normal conversational voices. There was something in the tone, in the tension, that made Edward stop halfway up the stairs and listen. "I've already told you I don't want to hear excuses, Melissa. You spilled water on the kitchen floor. You were careless, irresponsible." Melissa's voice was small, trembling. "It was an accident, Sylvia. The glass slipped out of my hand." "An accident? Everything with you is an accident. Do you think the world is going to accept your excuses forever? Do you think your father is going to keep supporting an incompetent girl who can't even hold a glass properly? Edward frowned. That seemed a bit extreme for a simple spilled glass of water. He went up a few more steps, silently. You are going to clean that kitchen until it's spotless. And after that, you know where you'll be spending the night. There was a pause. Edward heard a muffled sob. Please, Sylvia, not tonight. I promise I'll be more careful, please. I'm not interested in your promises. Actions have consequences. You need to learn that. Edward reached the top of the stairs, and the voices stopped immediately. Sylvia came out of Melissa's room, closing the door behind her, and ran into him in the hallway. Her face, which seconds before had been hard and cold, instantly transformed into a soft, welcoming expression. Edward, what a nice surprise. You're home early today. He looked at her, then at the closed door to Melissa's room. What was going on in there? Sylvia sighed, as if carrying a heavy burden. Oh, darling. Melissa spilled water in the kitchen and was throwing a tantrum instead of cleaning it up. You know how kids this age are. Everything is a reason to whine. But don't worry, I've handled it. She's learning responsibility. Edward hesitated. There was something about the story that didn't quite fit, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Was she crying? A little, but it's manipulation, darling. She knows that if she cries, she'll get attention. She'll get out of facing the consequences. We can't fall into that trap. We have to be firm. Edward nodded slowly. It made sense, or at least it seemed to. Can I talk to her? Sylvia touched his arm gently. Of course you can. But remember, be firm. Don't show any pity. If she senses you feel sorry for her, she'll use it against us. Kids are smart like that. Edward nodded in understanding and opened the door to Melissa's room. The girl was sitting on the bed, her eyes red, her hands trembling slightly. When she saw her father, she tried to smile, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Hi, Dad. Edward sat on the edge of the bed, uncomfortable. He didn't know how to begin. Hi, honey. Sylvia told me you spilled some water in the kitchen. Melissa lowered her head. It was an accident, Dad. I was getting a glass and it slipped. It's okay, accidents happen, but you need to be more careful, Melissa, and you need to learn to handle the consequences without making a scene. Sylvia is teaching you important things, responsibility, discipline. It'll help you in the future. Melissa didn't answer. She just nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. Edward stayed there for a few more seconds, waiting for her to say something, to ask for help, to give any sign that something was wrong. But Melissa remained silent, and he, not knowing how to handle it, just touched her shoulder briefly and stood up. Okay, go get some rest now, all right? When Edward left the room and closed the door, Melissa hugged her knees and let the tears fall silently. She had almost told him, almost begged her father to help her. But Sylvia's words echoed in her mind. No one will believe you. They'll say you're making up stories to get attention, and if you tell, it will be much worse. So she stayed quiet, as always. Later that night, after Edward was asleep, Sylvia entered Melissa's room and woke her with a cold touch on her shoulder. Get up. You know where to go. Melissa got up silently, her eyes still swollen from crying. She followed Sylvia down the dark hallway, down the service stairs, to the storage closet off the laundry room, the same place as always. Sylvia opened the door and pointed inside. You stay here until 6 in the morning. No noise, no whining. If I hear a single sound, you'll be here tomorrow night too. Understood? Melissa entered the closet, her body already accustomed to the ritual. She lay down on the thin blanket folded in the corner, curled up to try to stay warm, and closed her eyes. The floor was hard and cold. The air smelled of mildew and cleaning products, but she was used to it now. This was her new reality. Outside, Sylvia closed the door with quiet satisfaction. Everything was going according to plan. With each passing night, Melissa grew weaker, more controllable, more broken. Soon, it would be easy to convince Edward that the girl needed intensive psychological help, maybe even admission to a specialized clinic. And then, with Melissa out of the way, Sylvia would have Edward all to herself, and more importantly, she would have full access to the family's fortune. But what Sylvia didn't know was that her actions were leaving a trail, and that there were people watching, taking notes, and putting together the pieces of a puzzle that would soon reveal the whole truth. The next morning, Mrs. Teresa arrived at the mansion at 6:30 as always. As she passed the service area hallway, she saw Melissa coming out of the storage closet, barefoot, shivering from the cold, her eyes empty. The girl was startled to see Teresa, but the housekeeper just approached and hugged her in silence. She didn't say a word. She just held the fragile child for a few seconds, trying to offer a little warmth, a little security. Afterward, Teresa went to her small notebook hidden in her locker drawer and wrote, September 17th, Melissa found leaving the storage closet at 6:30 a.m. Appearance, tired, shivering, barefoot, night temperature, 54 degrees. Meanwhile, at school, Julia Anderson was growing, more and more concerned. Melissa had been absent 2 days the previous week, and when she returned, she seemed even more withdrawn. During reading class, Julia asked the students to read a passage from a book about happy families. Melissa started to read, but halfway through the sentence, her voice broke. She closed the book and asked to go to the bathroom. Julia let her go, but followed her discreetly. In the bathroom, Melissa was leaning against the sink, crying softly, trying to control her sobs so no one would hear. Julia entered slowly and knelt beside her. Melissa, what's going on? Please trust me, I want to help you. The girl wiped her tears quickly, as if by reflex. It's nothing, Miss Anderson. I'm just tired. You always say you're tired, but I can see it's more than that. Are you scared of something? Is someone hurting you? Melissa looked at Julia with frightened eyes. For a moment, it seemed like she was going to tell her everything, but then she shook her head vigorously. No, Miss Anderson. No one is hurting me. Everything's fine at home. My stepmom takes really good care of me. I just haven't been sleeping well, but it'll pass. Julia didn't believe her, but she didn't push. She knew that forcing a traumatized child to talk could make things worse. So she just said, Okay, but if you change your mind, if you ever want to talk, I'll be here. Always. You can trust me, Melissa. The girl nodded and went back to the classroom. But Julia stayed there, in the empty bathroom, feeling the weight of her helplessness. She knew something was terribly wrong. But without Melissa's confirmation, without concrete proof, what could she do? Calling Child Protective Services without evidence could worsen the child's situation. She needed more time, more information. That afternoon, Julia decided to make an unannounced visit to the Millers' home. She used the address from Melissa's school file and drove to the mansion on the Upper East Side. When she rang the doorbell, it was Sylvia who answered, with a cordial but distant smile. Good afternoon. How can I help you? Good afternoon. I'm Julia Anderson, Melissa's teacher. I'd like to speak with her father for a moment, if possible. Sylvia maintained her smile, but her eyes narrowed slightly. My husband is in an important meeting right now, but I'm Melissa's stepmother. We can talk if you'd like. Julia hesitated. She would have preferred to speak directly with the father, but maybe this was an opportunity to observe more closely. Of course. Thank you. Sylvia led her to the elegant and impeccable living room. She offered coffee, which Julia politely declined. Then Sylvia sat down with perfect posture and asked, So, Miss Anderson, did something happen with Melissa at school? Actually, I'm worried about her. Melissa has been showing signs of emotional distress. She's always tired, withdrawn, and today she even cried during class. I wanted to understand if everything is okay at home. Sylvia sighed, as if dealing with a recurring problem. Ms. Anderson, I understand your concern, but the truth is, Melissa is going through a difficult adjustment phase. She still hasn't fully accepted my presence in her life, and unfortunately, she's been creating dramatic situations to try to manipulate us, to make people feel sorry for her. Julia frowned. Manipulate? Yes, children are very clever. She's realized that if she acts like a victim, people will give her attention. It's a common defense mechanism in children who have lost a parent. We're working on it with her, setting clear boundaries, teaching her responsibility. But the signs I'm seeing don't seem like just a bid for attention. She seems genuinely frightened. Sylvia smiled patiently. Ms. Anderson, with all due respect, I live with her. I see her day to day. And I can assure you she has a comfortable home, quality food, an excellent education. My husband and I do everything for her. But she needs to learn that she can't have everything her way. Life has rules, and we're teaching her that. Julia wasn't convinced, but she realized it was no use arguing with Sylvia. She needed to speak directly with Edward. I understand. Still, I'd like to schedule a meeting with her father. It's important that he's aware of what's happening at school. Sylvia kept her smile, but there was a hardness in her eyes. Of course. I'll pass the message on to my husband. He'll get in touch with you. Julia stood up, thanked her, and left. But as she drove back home, a certainty grew inside her. That woman was lying. There was something deeply wrong in that house, and she needed to find out what it was before it was too late. That night, Sylvia told Edward about the teacher's visit, but completely distorted the conversation. Melissa's teacher showed up here today. She's worried because Melissa has been crying at school, making up stories about being mistreated at home. I explained that it's all manipulation, but I think it would be good for you to talk to her, so she understands that we're doing what's best for the girl. Edward grew concerned. Melissa is making up stories. She is. She wants attention. She wants people to feel sorry for her. It's normal, darling, but we need to nip this in the bud before it gets worse. Maybe it's time we seek professional help. A child psychologist, someone who can assess if she needs more intensive support. Edward nodded, completely trusting Sylvia's words. You're right. I'll schedule an appointment. But what Edward didn't know was that Sylvia already had it all planned. She had researched and found a psychologist who, for a generous fee, could provide a false report diagnosing Melissa with severe emotional disorders. With that report in hand, it would be easy to convince Edward that the girl needed to be admitted to a specialized clinic. And then finally, Sylvia would have what she wanted, total control. Meanwhile, Mr. Anthony and Mrs. Teresa met again, this time at a coffee shop near the mansion. Teresa showed him the notes she had been taking, dates, times, detailed observations. Anthony was shocked by the amount of evidence she had gathered. This is very serious, Mrs. Teresa. This girl is being abused. We have to do something. But what, Mr. Anthony? If we go straight to Mr. Miller, he won't believe us. He trusts that woman blindly. Anthony thought for a moment. We need irrefutable proof, something he can't deny. Like what? Photos, videos, recordings, something that shows exactly what's happening. Teresa nodded slowly. But how do we get that without being discovered? Anthony had an idea. He knew a security technician who installed discrete cameras. Maybe they could install some hidden cameras in the house, in the strategic places where Sylvia usually took Melissa. It would be risky, but it was the only way to get concrete proof. Leave it to me. I'll see what I can do. But you need to keep writing everything down. Every detail could be important. Teresa agreed, and for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could save Melissa before it was too late. Meanwhile, inside her room, Melissa was lying on her bed, staring at the dark ceiling. She knew that soon Sylvia would come for her, like every other night. She knew she would have to go to that cold, scary place. She knew she would have to be silent, not cry, not make a sound. And she knew that in the morning she would have to wake up, get ready, go to school, and pretend that everything was fine. It was like this every day, an endless cycle of fear, pain, and silence. But somewhere deep in her tired heart, Melissa still held on to a small fragment of hope. The hope that one day someone would see through the lies, someone would believe her, someone would save her. And without her knowing, that day was closer than she imagined. The days that followed were marked by a silent intensification of Melissa's suffering. Sylvia, feeling she was consolidating her control over the situation, became bolder in her cruelty. The nights in the storage closet became more frequent. Any small slip-up, any insignificant mistake was used as justification for the punishment. A glass left on the counter, a backpack not perfectly organized, a response that Sylvia deemed inappropriate. Edward, for his part, was increasingly immersed in a new business project, the construction of a massive residential complex in Queens. The development involved tens of millions of dollars. hundreds of employees, and demanded his attention almost 24 hours a day. He left home before 7 in the morning and returned after 10 at night. On weekends, he locked himself in his office to review contracts, analyze blueprints, and discuss strategies with his partners. Sylvia encouraged this dedication. Whenever Edward thought about taking a day off, she would say, "Darling, you're so close to closing this deal. You can't stop now. I'll take care of everything here. Melissa is fine. The house is in order. You focus on work, which is what you do best." And Edward believed her, because it was easier to believe than to question, because it was more comfortable to trust Sylvia than to face the possibility that something was terribly wrong right under his nose. But there were moments, small flashes of lucidity, when Edward felt that something wasn't right. Once, arriving home late at night, he found Melissa sitting on the stairs hugging her knees. The girl was startled to see him, as if she'd been caught doing something forbidden. "Melissa, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be asleep?" She stood up quickly, avoiding his gaze. "I just came down for some water, Dad. I'm going back to my room now." Edward looked at her more closely. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen. "Are you okay? You look like you've been crying." "No, I haven't, Dad. I'm just tired." He wanted to ask more, to sit down beside her, and really talk, to understand what was happening. But then Sylvia appeared at the top of the stairs, in her silk robe and rehearsed smile. "Edward, I didn't hear you come in." "Melissa, honey, what are you doing there? It's late. Go up to your room now." Melissa obeyed immediately, climbing the stairs in silence. Edward stood there feeling a discomfort he couldn't name. Sylvia came down to him and touched his face affectionately. "She had a nightmare. Sometimes she wakes up scared. But she's better now. Come on, you must be tired." And Edward let her guide him to their room. Let Sylvia's rational explanations erase his unease. After all, it was easier that way. At school, Melissa's situation was becoming critical. She had fainted during gym class. The gym teacher, frightened, took her immediately to the nurse's office. The school nurse, an experienced woman named Valerie, examined Melissa carefully. The girl was dehydrated, with clear signs of malnutrition and sleep deprivation. "Melissa, when was the last time you ate a full meal?" Valerie asked gently. "I ate this morning." "What did you have?" "A piece of toast with butter." "And for dinner last night?" Melissa hesitated. "I didn't have dinner. I wasn't hungry." Valerie frowned. This wasn't normal. She picked up the phone and called the Miller's house. Sylvia answered with her sweet, controlled voice. "Mrs. Miller, this is Nurse Valerie from Melissa's school. She fainted during gym class. She's fine now, but she's showing signs of malnutrition and dehydration. I'd like you to come pick her up." On the other end of the line, Sylvia reacted with perfectly rehearsed concern. "Oh my goodness, I'm on my way right now. Melissa has been so stubborn about eating. She doesn't want to eat properly, keeps making up excuses that she's not hungry. We're trying to deal with it, but she's very resistant." Valerie didn't like the response, but she noted everything and hung up. When Sylvia arrived at the school, she was all solicitude and maternal worry. She took Melissa home, but in the car her tone changed completely. "You are going to stop making a scene at school, Melissa. Fainting during class, drawing attention like that, it's unacceptable. Tonight you're going to learn what happens when you embarrass this family." Melissa didn't answer. She just looked out the car window, silent tears streaming down her face. That night, Sylvia sent her to the storage closet earlier than usual, and this time she didn't leave the blanket. Melissa spent the entire night huddled on the cold concrete floor, shivering, hungry, exhausted. When Mrs. Teresa found her the next morning, the girl could barely stand. Teresa helped her up, took her to the bathroom and gave her some warm water and a hidden piece of bread. And then, with tears in her eyes, Teresa made more notes in her notebook. Notes that would soon become essential to saving Melissa. Meanwhile, Mr. Anthony was putting his plan into action. He contacted a friend who was a security tech, explained the situation carefully, and together they planned the installation of discrete cameras in the mansion. It was risky, but necessary. They chose strategic locations: the hallway near the storage closet, the kitchen, the second-floor hallway. Places where Sylvia usually acted with more freedom, believing no one was watching. The installation was done on a Sunday, when Sylvia had gone to a charity event, and Edward was in an emergency meeting at his office. Anthony and the technician worked quickly, installing tiny, almost invisible cameras connected to a remote recording system that Anthony could access from his phone. When they finished, Anthony felt a mix of relief and apprehension. Now it was just a matter of time until they got the proof they needed. But he also knew that every day that passed was another day of suffering for Melissa. That same week, Edward finally scheduled a meeting with Julia Anderson. He arrived at the school in his black BMW, impeccable suit, confident posture. Julia received him in her classroom, and from the first moment, she knew she had to choose her words very carefully. "Mr. Miller, thank you for coming, I know. You're a very busy man." Edward waved his hand, dismissing the formalities. "My wife told me you're concerned about Melissa, that she's been making up stories." Julia took a deep breath. "Mr. Miller, with all due respect, I don't think Melissa is making up stories. I think she is genuinely suffering. She shows clear signs of emotional trauma, social withdrawal, sleep deprivation, malnutrition, constant fear. These are not the characteristics of a child who is just seeking attention." Edward frowned. "Malnutrition? Melissa has top-quality food at home. We have a cook. She eats whatever she wants. But she's losing weight, Mr. Miller. And she fainted during gym class from dehydration. That's not normal." Edward was silent for a moment. That bothered him. But then he remembered Sylvia's words. Melissa was being resistant to eating. She was playing the victim to get attention. "Ms. Anderson, I understand your concern, but Melissa is going through a difficult phase. She lost her mother, got a stepmother. It's natural for there to be resistance, for her to create dramatic situations. My wife is working on it with her with patience and firmness, and we are seeking professional help. A psychologist who can assess if she needs more intensive support." Julia felt a tightness in her chest. She knew what that meant. Sylvia was laying the groundwork to isolate Melissa even further, perhaps even have her committed somewhere. And Edward, by blindly trusting his wife, was allowing it to happen. "Mr. Miller, I am begging you to watch your daughter more closely. Talk to her. Really listen to what she has to say, because I am certain that something is very wrong in that house." Edward stood up, clearly annoyed. "Ms. Anderson, I appreciate your concern, but I know my daughter, and I trust my wife. Melissa is well taken care of. Good afternoon." And he walked out of the room, leaving Julia with a feeling of powerlessness and despair. She had tried, but she couldn't make Edward see the truth. Now all she could do was hope that someone, somehow, could save Melissa before it was too late. That night, Edward came home feeling pensive. The conversation with the teacher had bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He went up to Melissa's room and knocked on the door. The girl was sitting on her bed, flipping through a book without really reading. "To Melissa, can I come in?" She nodded, and Edward sat down beside her. For a long moment they sat in silence. Then Edward said, "Your teacher is worried about you. She said you've been sad, tired. Is that true?" Melissa looked at her father, and for a second Edward saw something in her eyes, a silent cry for help. But then she lowered her head and mumbled, "I'm fine, Dad. Just a little tired from school." "Are you sure? Because if something is bothering you, you can tell me. I'm your father. I'm here to protect you." Melissa wanted to scream. She wanted to tell him everything, about the nights in the storage closet, about the cold, about the fear, about Sylvia's cruel words. But the threats echoed in her mind. "No one will believe you. They'll say you're a liar. And if you tell, it will be much worse." So she just forced a smile and said, "I'm sure, Dad, everything's fine." Edward gave her a quick, awkward and distant hug, and then stood up. "Okay, but if you need anything, just let me know, all right?" Melissa nodded, and he left the room. But when the door closed, she buried her face in her pillow and cried silently, knowing that her father had been so close to discovering the truth, but had failed to see it. And so the days continued, an endless cycle of pain, fear, and silence. But unbeknownst to anyone, the cameras installed by Mr. Anthony were recording everything. Every cruel command, every veiled threat, every night Melissa was forced to spend in the storage closet. The evidence was piling up, and soon the truth would come to light in a way that Edward could no longer ignore. The first week of October brought a subtle but significant change in the New York City weather. The nights grew colder, the wind blew stronger, and there was a sense that something was about to change. For Melissa, each night became harder to endure. The cold of the storage closet seeped into her bones, and she had developed a persistent cough that Sylvia completely ignored. In the recordings that Mr. Anthony religiously reviewed every night, the evidence was devastating. He had captured Sylvia dragging Melissa by the arm to the storage closet, had recorded the cold and cruel commands, had registered the girl's silent tears. But Anthony knew he had to choose the right moment to show everything to Edward. If he acted rashly, Sylvia could destroy the evidence or create an even more convincing narrative. Meanwhile, Sylvia was executing the next phase of her plan. She had scheduled an appointment with a private psychologist, Dr. Robert Vance, a middle-aged man with a luxurious office near Park Avenue. Vance had a questionable reputation among his peers, known for providing dubious medical reports for those who paid enough. Sylvia had researched carefully before choosing him. At the first appointment, Sylvia accompanied Melissa and presented the doctor with a completely distorted version of the facts. After a half-hour superficial consultation, Vance dismissed Melissa and spoke alone with Sylvia, promising the report she needed to justify a possible institutionalization of the girl. But what Sylvia didn't know was that Mrs. Teresa had discreetly followed them to the office and noted the address. She shared the information with Mr. Anthony, who began to investigate Dr. Vance. In just a few hours of online research, he discovered that the doctor had been sued twice for issuing false reports. Anthony decided it was time to act. He spent the next few days compiling all the recordings, organizing them chronologically, creating an irrefutable file. Each video clearly showed the emotional abuse Melissa was suffering, the cruel commands, the veiled threats, the child being forced to sleep on the cold floor of the storage closet. It was enough evidence to completely destroy the facade Sylvia had built. The following Thursday, Edward's big deal was finalized. He signed the contracts, shook hands, received congratulations. He made more in one day than many would earn in a lifetime, but when he left his office at 6 in the evening, instead of feeling satisfaction, he felt only emptiness. He decided to do something he hadn't done in months: go home early and spend time with Melissa, call her, have a real conversation, maybe take her out to dinner. Just the two of them, father and daughter. But when he arrived home, he found the mansion strangely silent. Sylvia wasn't in the living room as usual. He went upstairs to Melissa's room. He knocked on the door. Silence. He opened it slowly and found the room empty. The bed was perfectly made, as if no one had slept there. A chill ran down his spine. Where was his daughter? He rushed down the stairs, calling for Sylvia. He found her in the kitchen, preparing tea with a rehearsed calm. The conversation that followed was tense, and Edward felt that something was deeply wrong. He started searching the house. He called for Melissa. He checked every room, every bathroom, nothing. It was then that he heard a soft noise coming from the service area, a faint sound, almost imperceptible. He followed the sound and found the door to the storage closet slightly ajar. He opened it fully, and there, huddled on the cold floor, was Melissa, barefoot, shivering, wearing only thin pajamas. Edward's world stopped. "Melissa?" His voice came out as a strangled whisper. "What are you doing here?" The girl was startled, her eyes wide with fear. She tried to stand up quickly, but her legs were numb from the cold. "Dad, I was just—" Edward knelt beside her, his hands shaking. "Why are you here? Why are you on the floor? Where's your blanket? Your slippers?" Melissa couldn't answer. The tears began to fall, and she just shook her head. It was then that Sylvia appeared at the door, trying to maintain the charade with false concern. But Edward wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his daughter, at her fragile body shivering from the cold, at her frightened eyes, at the marks on the floor that indicated this wasn't the first time she had been there. And finally, for the first time in months, he truly saw. "How long has this been happening?" His voice was low, dangerously calm. Melissa didn't answer. She just cried. "Melissa!" His voice rose, but it wasn't anger directed at her. It was desperation. "How long have you been sleeping here?" The girl sobbed. "Since she came, since the beginning." Edward felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. He scooped Melissa into his arms, wrapping her in his suit jacket, trying to warm her. She was ice cold, shaking violently. He carried her out of the storage closet and turned to Sylvia, and for the first time he really saw her. He saw the liar, the manipulator, the woman who had tortured his daughter right under his nose, while he worked blindly, trusting her. "You—" He could barely speak, rage and guilt churning in his chest. "You did this to her." Sylvia tried to maintain her composure, but there was a calculating glint in her eyes. "Edward, it's not what it looks like. Melissa has problems. She creates situations, makes up stories. I tried to tell you, I tried to explain that she needed professional help, but you were too busy to listen." "No!" Edward's voice echoed through the house. "Don't you dare turn this on me. Don't you dare twist the truth. My daughter was sleeping on the floor of a cold storage closet, an 8-year-old child, and you knew. You did this to her." Melissa clung to her father, crying convulsively, years of fear and pain, finally being released. At that moment, Mr. Anthony, who had heard the shouting, came in through the back door. He had been waiting for this moment, and now he knew it was time. "Mr. Miller, I need to show you something." Edward looked at him, his eyes filled with tears. "What is it, Anthony?" "I installed security cameras in the house a few weeks ago, because I suspected something was happening to Melissa. The recordings show everything." Sylvia turned pale. "You did what?" Anthony ignored her and handed a flash drive to Edward. "It's all here, sir. Everything she did. Everything Melissa suffered." Edward held the flash drive with trembling hands, still hugging Melissa. He looked at Sylvia, and in that gaze was everything. Anger, betrayal, despair, crushing guilt. "Get out of my house." Sylvia tried to stay calm. "Edward, you're being irrational. You're listening to a manipulative child and an employee who clearly hates me. Let's talk calmly. Look at things rationally." "I said get out of my house." Edward's voice made the walls tremble. Sylvia realized she had lost. Her carefully constructed plan had crumbled. She grabbed her purse, shot one last look of hatred at Melissa, and walked out the front door without another word. When the door closed, Edward allowed himself to break down. He sank to the floor, still holding Melissa, and cried. He cried for all the months he had been blind. He cried for every night his daughter had spent cold and afraid. He cried for the trust he had placed in the wrong person. He cried for the child he had almost lost. "I'm so sorry," he whispered into Melissa's hair. "I'm sorry I didn't see. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. I'm sorry, my daughter, I'm so sorry." Melissa, for the first time in so long, felt safe. In her father's arms, finally protected, finally believed, she let out all her accumulated pain. And as she cried, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Mrs. Teresa, who had arrived at that moment through the kitchen door, stood frozen as she saw the scene. Tears streamed down her face as she witnessed what she had hoped for so long, Edward finally seeing the truth, finally protecting his daughter. She approached silently and placed a warm blanket over Melissa's shoulders. Edward carried Melissa to her room, and for the first time in months, she slept in her own bed. He stayed by her side, holding her hand, watching her pale, tired face as she finally relaxed and slept deeply. And there, in that silent vigil, Edward made a vow. He would never again allow something like this to happen. He would never again choose work over his daughter. He would never again blindly trust someone when it came to her well-being. The days that followed were a flurry of intense action. Edward contacted his personal lawyer, Mr. Arthur Stone, one of the best criminal defense attorneys in New York. He showed him all the recordings, all the notes Mrs. Teresa had made, all the signs of abuse that had been documented. Arthur was shocked. "Edward, this is extremely serious. We have enough material to sue your ex-wife for emotional abuse, child endangerment. She could face years in prison." Edward requested an emergency protective order, which was granted within 48 hours. Sylvia was forbidden from coming within 500 yards of Melissa. He also took Melissa for a full medical evaluation. Dr. Patricia Lewis was horrified when she examined the girl. Moderate malnutrition, signs of chronic sleep deprivation, severe anxiety, deep emotional trauma. "Mr. Miller," the doctor said seriously, "your daughter is going to need intensive psychological support. The trauma she has suffered is significant, but with the right treatment, family support, and time, she can make a full recovery." Edward nodded, determined. "I'll do whatever it takes." He contacted Dr. Marina Cole, a child psychologist specializing in trauma. The first sessions were difficult, but Marina was patient. She used drawings, games, and play therapy techniques to help Melissa process the trauma without forcing her to verbally relive painful moments. Slowly, Melissa began to open up. She told them about the cold nights, the constant fear, the cruel words that made her feel like she deserved the suffering. Marina validated her feelings, helping her understand that nothing that happened was her fault. "You are a very brave girl, Melissa," Marina would say. "To survive all of that and still be able to tell your story, that's real courage." Edward participated in some of the sessions, learning how to support his daughter, how to rebuild their broken trust. He realized it wasn't enough to just remove Sylvia from their lives. He had to actively rebuild his bond with Melissa. And that's exactly what he did. Edward made drastic changes to his professional life. He delegated more responsibilities to his partners and managers. He set firm hours. He would be home for dinner with Melissa every day. He would take her to and from school whenever possible. Weekends would be dedicated exclusively to her. At first, Melissa was surprised. She wasn't used to having her father present. But slowly, she got used to it. Dinners together became a sacred ritual. Edward would ask about her day, listen to her stories, her worries, her dreams, and for the first time in years he truly listened. One evening, 3 weeks after Sylvia had left, Edward and Melissa were sitting on the patio looking at the stars. Melissa was wrapped in a warm blanket, sipping hot chocolate. "Dad?" she said suddenly. "Yes, honey." "Are you doing all this because you feel guilty?" The question caught Edward by surprise. He thought carefully before answering. "I do feel guilty, yes, a lot of guilt, for not noticing, for not protecting you when I should have. But that's not the only reason I'm here. I'm here because I love you, because you are the most important thing in my life, and because I realized I spent way too much time building things that don't matter and neglecting the one thing that truly does, you." Melissa looked at him with shining eyes. "I thought you didn't like me, that I was just a burden to you." Edward felt his heart break. He pulled Melissa into a tight hug. "Never. Don't you ever think that. You're my daughter. You're my joy. I was a terrible father, I know, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to fix it, trying to be the dad you deserve." Melissa snuggled against him, and for the first time she could remember, she felt truly loved. The following months were a time of profound transformation. The case against Sylvia moved forward with relentless force. The evidence was so damning that her lawyers tried to negotiate plea deals multiple times, but Edward was unyielding. She was indicted on multiple charges: emotional abuse, child endangerment, gross negligence. The proceedings revealed even more about her sinister plans. Emails exchanged with Dr. Vance discussing the false report, conversations with lawyers about how to gain financial control through Melissa, searches for psychiatric facilities for minors. Everything pointed to a cold, calculated, and utterly cruel plan. The investigation also revealed that Sylvia had done this before. In her previous marriage, she had manipulated situations to alienate her husband from his children from a prior relationship. The pattern was clear. She identified successful, vulnerable men, approached them with charm and efficiency, and then tried to eliminate any obstacle to her total control over their assets and decisions. Edward felt sickened to realize that he and Melissa had been just another target in a series of schemes. Dr. Vance was also investigated. It was discovered that he had issued dozens of false reports over the years, always for a generous fee. He lost his medical license and also faced criminal charges. Julia Anderson and a social worker were called to testify, and their testimonies were essential in corroborating the pattern of Melissa's behavioral changes. But more important than Sylvia's punishment was Melissa's recovery. And that recovery was happening, slowly but steadily. The sessions with Dr. Cole continued twice a week, and Melissa blossomed with each passing day. The smile, which had been gone for so long, returned to her face. At first it was shy, hesitant, as if she were afraid it would be taken from her again. But gradually it became genuine, spontaneous, real. She started to play again. Edward bought paints, brushes, canvases, and turned one of the empty rooms in the mansion into an art studio for Melissa. She spent hours there painting, drawing, expressing through colors what was still difficult to express with words. Her first drawings were dark, full of shadows and sad figures. But over time, vibrant colors began to appear. Houses with lit windows, families holding hands, rainbows and butterflies. The dark circles that had marked her face for months gradually faded. Her pale skin regained a rosy color. She gained weight. Her arms and legs were no longer so thin they looked like they might break at the slightest touch. Most importantly, she slept peacefully in her bed every night. Edward made a point of going to her room before he went to bed, kissing her forehead and tucking her in with care. And Melissa slept deeply, without nightmares, without fear of the dark, without the terror of being torn from her bed and taken to that cold place. There were setbacks, of course, nights when Melissa would wake, up screaming, drenched in a cold sweat, reliving the moments of terror. In those moments, Edward was always there. He would hold her, turn on the lights, and talk to her until the fear passed. "You're safe," he would repeat like a mantra. "I'm here. Nothing is going to hurt you. You're safe, my daughter. You always will be." And slowly, the nightmares became less frequent. From every night to a few times a week, from a few times a week to occasionally. Until, months later, Melissa could sleep through the night without waking up scared. Edward also changed profoundly. The transformation was not just external, but internal. He established a sacred routine with Melissa, and for the first time in his life, he followed it religiously. Every morning, without exception, they woke up together at 7. Edward prepared breakfast himself. Pancakes on weekends, oatmeal during the week, always with fresh fruit and juice. They ate together, talking about their plans for the day, about dreams from the night before, about absolutely nothing and absolutely everything. He drove her to school personally, even when he had important meetings scheduled. Those 20 minutes in the car became sacred. Melissa would tell him about her friends, her teachers, what she was learning. Edward listened, truly listened, asking questions, showing genuine interest. He didn't check emails at red lights, didn't answer calls, didn't think about contracts. Those 20 minutes were just for them. In the afternoon, when Melissa came home from school, they did homework together at the kitchen table. Edward was surprised to find that he actually enjoyed helping his daughter with math, English, and science. He saw the pride in her eyes when she solved a difficult problem, and he felt a satisfaction that no multi-million-dollar deal had ever given him. Sometimes, when the homework was done, they would bake cookies together or do simple science experiments that left the kitchen a mess and Melissa laughing hysterically. Dinners became sacred, non-negotiable events. Mrs. Teresa prepared the meals, but Edward made a point of setting the table, lighting candles, creating a warm atmosphere. No phones at the table, no work talk, no TV on. Just father and daughter, sharing their day, laughing, talking, planning. Melissa began to open up more during these dinners, talking about her worries, her fears, her joys. And Edward learned to listen not just to the words, but to the silences as well. Weekends were dedicated exclusively to creating new, happy memories that could overwrite the painful ones. Edward took Melissa to the zoo, and they spent hours watching the animals, taking pictures, laughing at the monkeys' antics. They went to an amusement park, and Edward, who had never been on a roller coaster in his life, held Melissa's hand tightly as they screamed together with excitement and fear. They had picnics in Central Park, spreading a large blanket under a tree, eating sandwiches that Edward had prepared clumsily but with all the love in the world. They rowed a paddle boat on the lake, with Melissa laughing every time the boat spun in circles because Edward couldn't coordinate the pedals right. They fed ducks, flew kites, visited museums. Simple things. Things Edward had never done, not even when Beatrice was alive. But now, seeing the sparkle in Melissa's eyes as they fed ducks on the lake, or when she shrieked with joy on the roller coaster, or when she stood in awe of a dinosaur exhibit, Edward understood what he had missed all those years, and he was determined not to miss another moment. Mrs. Teresa and Mr. Anthony remained fundamental pillars of support. Teresa cooked Melissa's favorite foods, sat with her to do homework, and told her funny stories. Anthony drove the girl to school, making sure she felt safe, telling her stories about when she was little, helping her reconnect with happy memories. 6 months after the revelation, Edward made a decision that surprised everyone. He sold his majority stake in the company to his partners. He didn't retire completely, but he drastically reduced his involvement in the business, and with part of the money from the sale, he created a foundation. The Beatrice Miller Foundation, named in honor of his first wife, had a clear mission: to help children who had suffered abuse and trauma. The foundation offered free therapy, legal support, and a safe space where wounded children could heal. Edward hired Marina as the director, and together they created a project that was already helping dozens of families. Melissa participated actively. She designed posters for the foundation, helped organize events, and sometimes, when she felt strong enough, she talked to other children who were going through difficult situations. Seeing her pain transformed into purpose helped her in her own healing. A year after that fateful night in the storage closet, Edward and Melissa took a special trip. They went to a quiet beach in the Hamptons, just the two of them. They walked on the sand, built castles, and talked about everything and nothing. On the last night of the trip, sitting on the porch of their rental looking at the sea under the moonlight, Melissa said something that deeply touched Edward's heart. "Dad, I forgive you." Edward looked at her, surprised. "You forgive me?" "For not noticing sooner, for taking so long to protect me. I know you're trying to fix it, and I see how much you've changed. I forgive you." Edward felt tears stream down his face. "Thank you, my daughter. Thank you for giving me this chance. I promise I will never let you down again." Melissa smiled, a genuine smile full of hope. "I know, Dad. I trust you." And in that moment, Edward realized he had finally succeeded. Not just in saving his daughter, but in winning back her trust, in rebuilding the bond that had been broken, in becoming the father Melissa had always deserved. The story of Edward and Melissa didn't end like a perfect fairy tale. There were still hard days, occasional nightmares, moments of sadness. The journey of healing is not linear, and they both knew that. But they faced everything together as a true family. Sylvia was eventually sentenced to 5 years for her crimes. The sentence served as an important precedent in cases of emotional abuse. But for Edward and Melissa, that no longer mattered. They had moved on, building a life based on love, presence, and truth. Mrs. Teresa stayed with the family, now not just as a housekeeper, but as an essential part of their core. Mr. Anthony also remained, a silent but ever-present protector. Together they formed an imperfect but real family, a family that had been through the fire and emerged stronger. And Edward learned the most important lesson of his life, that no professional achievement, no multi-million-dollar deal, no award or recognition could compare to the simple act of holding his daughter's hand while she slept in peace. That being present is not just a choice, but a sacred responsibility. And that true love is not measured in expensive gifts or material comfort, but in time, attention, and protection. Months later, on a sunny Sunday, Edward watched Melissa playing in the garden with other children from the foundation. She was laughing, running. She was alive, not just surviving, but truly living. And he realized that this simple moment of seeing his daughter happy was the only achievement that truly mattered. Because in the end, when all the companies were sold, when all the contracts were forgotten, when all the money no longer had meaning, what would remain was this: a father's love for his daughter, and the certainty that this time he had made the right choice. Edward hugged Melissa, as she ran up to him laughing. And in that embrace, he felt not just the present but also the promise of a better future, a future where she would grow up strong, confident, loved, a future where the nightmares of the past would be just distant memories overcome by the power of love and healing. And as the sun set over New York City, painting the sky in gold and pink, Edward whispered a final promise to himself and to the daughter he held in his arms. He would never again let the darkness win, because where there is true love, there is always light. And in their rebuilt family, the light had finally returned to shine. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Edward and Melissa has touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of pain, discovery, and rebuilding, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what part of this narrative resonated with you the most. Every day, we bring you intense stories like this one, stories that reveal the deepest side of the human soul, that make us reflect on what truly matters in life. Stories about love, family, overcoming adversity, and the strength we find in the most difficult moments. We'll see you in the next episode with a new story that will stir your emotions. Until then. At school, there were also visible changes. Julia Anderson was moved to tears seeing Melissa become participative in class again, smiling at her classmates, raising her hand to answer questions. The girl who months ago would doze off at her desk was now alert, engaged, happy. Julia spoke with Edward at a meeting and said with tears in her eyes, "Thank you for listening. Thank you for saving her." Edward just shook his head. "I should have listened sooner, but thank you for not giving up on her."